Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Osborne Pro TV. My name is Rob, and today I'm going to be covering part 2 of setting up Radius with wired devices or over Ethernet. I wanted to thank RH real quick for recommending that, or suggesting that I do the video. I think this is going to be a good one, so let's get started here. So this is part 2 of configuring Radius. You may remember from our previous video that we have Radius clients and a server set up on our network policy server, which is on Windows Server 2019. And we also have, we're using EAP-TLS for this configuration, and we're doing that because we don't want credentials that are stored with a weak hashing algorithm or a weak encryption method going through our tunnel. If an attacker compromises a machine in some way and they get the shared secret, they can capture and decrypt any packets and discover a password that way, so we want to prevent that from happening. We just want the machine to authenticate using a private key certificate, so life is good. So getting started here, first we have Radius clients. What we're going to do is add an 802.1x capable switch. To do that, we simply right-click on Radius clients in our network policy server and click New. I'm going to give it the name, which is just the host name of the switch right now, Tobor switch. And we're going to define the IP address, which is this. Select our shared secret template so that I ensure the password is not spelled incorrectly. Under Advanced, since I know this is a Cisco switch, I'm just going to select Cisco, click OK. And just like that, we have our switch, which is now a verified authenticator. This means supplicants or desktops/clients can send authentication requests to the switch. The switch will, or authenticator, will forward those requests on to the authentication server, which is the domain controller here. So there's nothing that we need to change in our Radius server configuration. If we go to our connection request policies, we still only have the one here that I'm going to keep. The difference is if under the conditions tab I click edit, and I want to make sure that Ethernet is selected here. We're going to leave wireless and wireless IEEE 802.11 selected and include Ethernet because we want to use Ethernet now. There is nowhere else here we need to set that, so we're going to click OK. The next thing under network policies, you'll notice I have added another policy name. I did this by simply right-clicking and selected duplicate policy. I then enabled it by right-clicking and selecting enable, and I renamed the policy. You can right-click and select rename. The reason for this is because I want to show how you can set up security groups as well. So the first one is EAP-TLS-desktops, and if we open this one up, notice that I have ignore user account dial and properties selected. Under conditions, we have a new area here, so we have machine groups. I simply included this by clicking the add button, selected machine groups, click add groups, and now I can define a security group in Active Directory containing machines. So I can select whichever group I want to add, click OK, and it will add it here, as you can see. Now, because EAP-TLS desktops is first, if a device is not inside this Radius devices group here, it's going to move on to the next policy, which is EAP-TLS laptops. And if I have a security group defined there as well, so if a client is not in the security group there, it will fail again, and then Radius will not be applied to that device, so no authentication will be attempted. Next thing is under our, I forgot to mention as well, in conditions, notice here I also have Ethernet added to the NAS port type as well. So we have Ethernet and wireless selected, meaning the desktops, in case they have a wireless NIC, can connect to the wireless network and be authenticated with Radius, and they'll also be authenticated while plugged into an Ethernet port, as long as we configure that on the switch. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Under authentication methods, we still have smart card or other certificate selected. This is because we're using EAP-TLS, and under NAS port type here, I have Ethernet selected as well, as long as the other wireless options. I click OK. Now, just to show you with laptops, we want to ignore user account dial-in properties. And under conditions, we have machine groups, and I have Radius laptops here. And notice I have wireless 802.11. We can also, but Ethernet is not selected. That's just to make this a little bit different and have a reason for creating the two separate groups. And so that is that. Under constraints, NAS port type again. If we were selecting Ethernet, we would check this box here as well. So that is all that we really need on our network policy server. We simply just needed to add our client to our already existing configuration and ensure that we have Ethernet included in our NAS port type, and we also included machine security groups just for the sake of doing that, to show it can be done, to kind of separate things out. Now we have under group policy, we want to create a radius profile that gets used. So to do that, we would simply, in our settings radius policy, you can create a new one if you like. Right click and select edit in group policy management area. This will open our new window here. So we'll drop down computer configuration, policies, Windows settings, security settings, and then we right click on wired network 802.3 policies, because 802.3 is the IEEE Ethernet standard. And we want to, I have one already, so let's just make this again. I will right click and select create a new wired network policy for Windows Vista and later releases. We will call this Radius Ethernet, and the description will be allow 802.1x authentication for devices, whatever. Now that that's all set, we want to go to our security tab. This is the most important part, so leave this first box checked, and we want to select smart card or other certificate here for the authentication method. This is because we're using EAP-TLS, and we want to make sure that certificate's used. Next, we click properties, and we want to leave use a certificate on this computer. We also want to leave checked use simple certificate selection. Verify this server's identity by validating the certificate, and we're also going to connect to these servers, and here we would define our radius authentication servers. So anything that you have the network policy server installed on, we want to have that defined here. So I have that IP address. Under trusted root certificate authorities, we want to select I've installed my CA a couple times for testing and such, but we would want basically any of your domain certificates that are issuing these radius certs, you want to have them trusted, so that's why we're checking those there. I leave these unchecked because I don't want to prompt users to authorize new servers or trusted certification authorities. You can if you want, however it might create some confusion, and you're better off just leaving this way because we have it only trusting our certificate authority and such. So next we're going to click advanced, and here we're going to check certificate issuer, and we're going to go down and select our certificate authorities again, and I'll leave extended key usage unchecked. So we click OK. Now that we have all this configured, just to mention it, if we want to add a second one, we use a semicolon, and then we would add our second radius server here. If you wanted to add more than one, you can also use host names here as well. So now we click OK, and for authentication method, I forgot to change this. We want to make this computer only, and this ensures that this is because we're not using user credentials to authorize a device. We're just using the certificate. You can use max authentication failures. Typically 1 is fine. You're welcome to set this to 2 if you like, but if 1 failure is a good way to go, so you're not locking machines out. Next we click OK, and now our wired group policy is set. Anytime we want a machine to use radius authentication, we can simply apply this policy to it. If you have this policy applied to a device on your network and it's attached to a switch that does not have radius configured, it's not going to hurt anything or break communication. That device is still going to be able to communicate over the network. The only way you could break communication is on the switch side, which we're going to get to next here. So let me get signed in here to our switch, because that's the next section we're going to cover. And I'm signing into the GUI here to kind of show you how things change with our commands. And hopefully I typed it in correctly that time. I think I did. Am I still SSH'd in? I am not. And I'm going to sign in with SSH2. This way we can cover some of the CLI commands and the web browser. Alrighty. So, first things first here, in the GUI, if we go under to the Security tab, we can select Radius, and that's going to be where we configure our Radius server. And notice here we have Radius accounting can be defined, so if we wanted to define that in our CLI, we would need to enter our configure area. And I'm sorry if I forget the term for the different sections of the CLI, like there's enable and configuration and your VTY. I forget what they're all called, so I'm just going to give basic names here. But we want to enable accounting, so we would do AAA accounting and .1x start stop and group radius, and that's it. So as soon as I do that, this is going to enable our port-based access control here. So I'm just going to move off it and go back, and you can see now our radius accounting is enabled. So accounting messages are going to get sent off to our radius server. However, we don't have a radius server configured yet. So next we're going to do that. That's going to put our radius server in this radius table down here. So to do that, we would do radius-server, and another side note here is this is an older switch and the Cisco commands change all the time, so they might be a little bit different. It's good to use, I use the question mark all the time in the CLI to find out the correct wording that they're looking for. So we have radius server host. We would define our host, which is our radius server, anywhere that you have the radius, the network policy server installed. So that's that IP address. Next, you can see we can define our authentication port, our accounting port, the timeout, retransmit, deadtime, key, which is the shared secret, priority, and usage. So we're going to do all those. Our auth-port is 1812, which is our default. Accounting port is 1813. Next, we're going to do our timeout. We'll do that 3, and we'll do a retransmit. So we try 3 times. Dead time we want to set to 0. Key is going to be we'll say my shared secret 1. And priority we're going to set to 0. This ensures that the radius server gets used first and nobody can cut the line ahead of it. This one has priority. And usage, priority 0. And usage, wow, I can't type today. Usage is .1x. And you'll see that we'll add, if we reload this page, we now have our radius server configured down here in our table. So this means this is now an authenticator, and it's going to submit requests using radius to the authentication server. Now, although we have this configured, none of this communication is happening yet because we have to do it on a port, basically. So next we would go to 802.1x under the Security tab over here, and we go to Properties. So first thing we want to do is enable port-based authentication. This allows us to enable the use of either MAC filtering or radius authentication on each individual port. So to enable that, we would do .1x on this one, and what is it called? System-auth-control. And that's it. So as you can see, if we reload the page here, we should see that that checkbox is now ticked. And now it is. Now for the authentication method, this may be a little counterintuitive, but by radius what they're talking about is user credentials. So radius none means user credentials are going to be attempted, and if they don't work, then nothing is attempted, and communication can continue basically. And if radius is selected, like it is now, user credentials are forced, and if they fail, that there's no communication. And we're going to select none because we're not using credentials, we're using EAP-TLS, and this is going to allow that communication to happen. Oh, so we can define that on our own here through the CLI. So we would do AAA, because this is authentication, it's authentication, .1x, default, and none. So AAA authentication, .1x, default, none. I'll also have these commands in the description of the video so you can get them easily. And now you'll see if I reload this page again, I should select a different thing there. Now that we have none selected. If you have SNMP enabled on your switch, you can enable the failure and success traps. So to do that, just cover that real quick, we would do .1x, traps, authentication, probably success, yeah, success, anything there, 802.1x, and we would do the same thing here, only for failure. And now if I reload this page, you can see that we have those buttons ticked. The guest VLAN, just to make a comment on that real quick, is it doesn't work with all the different port authentication or host modes that we're going to cover in just a minute here. So I suggest checking your documentation before enabling and working with this. But the idea behind the guest VLAN is if authentication fails for a device, they fail over to the guest VLAN, and then they're able to communicate in a limited network segment, so that they're kind of they have limited functionality basically. So that's what the guest VLAN is all about. Next, we're going to go to our port authentication, because right now we have enabled the use of radius. We have configured our radius server, and now we have to define whether radius is going to be used on our ports. So notice here, currently we have administrative port control. This is set to force authorized, and that means that we're allowing whatever device is connected here to communicate no matter what. We can also set to force unauthorized, we'll do this, let me go to edit. And forced unauthorized means nothing's going to be able to communicate on that port. And there's also auto, which is the one we're going to want to select, because this allows our 802.1x authentication. And notice down here that is also because 802.1x based authentication is checked. This is marked by default. And another thing I like to do when I'm enabling this is to, if I'm working with the GUI, is check re-authenticate now. This way, as soon as I set the setting, the authentication happens and I can see right away whether there was an issue with the client attached to the switch authenticating or not. And if there ever is, you can check the syslogs of the switch or the accounting or your NPS accounting logs to find out why that authentication failed. You can also do radius debug in your to get more information on why something may have failed. But let me just close this. No, I don't want to apply the changes. So to get to excuse me. So to get to this part of it, is fairly simple. So right now we have to do this on an interface basis. So we would go to interface. I'm going to do gigabit 2 since I have nothing attached to that one. And then it would be, we have .1x selection menu in here. So we're not going to do host mode yet. We're going to do authentication 802.1x. And we can select Mac authentication as well if we're going to include that, or web authentication. However, we're just using EAP-TLS for our port-based authentication, which in my opinion is plenty. If you really want to lock it down, you can do the Mac-based authentication as well. But this is enabling that. So by doing that, we're simply checking that box. We're checking this box here with that command. So the next thing we want to do is .1x, which one was it here? That's port control. Yeah, so .1x port control auto, that's going to set our administrative port control here to this value. So I'll do that as well. And now you'll see if I reload this page and go to the port, I'm going to click edit, or we can actually see it without it. Yes, now you see auto is selected. If the client that's attached to this port had a successful authentication, you're going to see authorized. If there was an issue with it, you're going to see unauthorized here. Because there's nothing attached right now, you're seeing NA. And just to cover that, I believe we've enabled everything we want to there. Yeah, so we have auto selected and 802.1x based authentication. So now on to our next section here, we go to host and session authentication. And this is where things get a little trickier. So multiple host 802.1x is what it's called on this, what the host mode is called on this version of Cisco iOS. If just to show you here, I'm going to select that and click edit. And you're going to see we have single host mode, multiple host 802.1x, and multiple sessions. Single host means that the first MAC address that connects to this port is going to attempt to be authenticated. Any other MAC address after that authentication is going to fail. It's only going to accept the one host. It also only accepts the data VLAN. It does not accept voice VLAN as well. Multiple sessions only accepts authenticated voice and data VLANs hosts, and multiple host 802.1x only authenticates the first device, and then the rest of the clients that might be connected to the port are allowed if you have a situation like that going on. But basically that means 802.1x capable devices and non-802.1x devices are going to be able to connect to this port, whereas multiple sessions is only 802.1x. So to set those modes, depending on how restrictive you want to be, or if you, I don't usually suggest using single host ever, because if you have to replace a device, you may forget that this is enabled and it might cause some unnecessary downtime or keep you somewhere placed longer than you need to be. You may not even be there when it gets replaced, and it'll take someone else some time to figure it out. So typically I'd suggest using multiple hosts or multiple sessions depending on how comfortable you are. Your physical port security is, I don't view that as being as important when the ports are locked down inside of a server room that has good physical security to it, because nobody's going in there other than you, hopefully, and plugging things in. But this may be needed on extensions where you have a patch switch or whatever, so use your own discretion for sure. Now if we want to set those back here, we're still on the host, so .1x hosts mode, and you can see we can select our multi-host, single host, or multi-sessions. So we're going to use multi-host mode, which is the default. And that is that. So now, just to review what we've covered so far, because this is about the end of the video, with Radius, we configured our Radius server. We have set the priority to 0. If I was going to add another Radius server here, I would set that priority to 1, and this way, if priority 0 fails, it goes over to our backup, which is priority 1. It also, if you set 2, that leaves room for an attacker to set a fake Radius server to priority 1 if they were to ever compromise this or whatever. And so you want to make that incremental. You don't want to leave gaps in between your priority numbers. And yeah, so that's that. We have that set, and we have Radius accounting, so that port-based access control authentication attempts are logged. If we were to select management access, this has to do with users logging in, and you can, which we're not using Radius for in that manner, it's just port-based. And then you can use port-based and management access if you like as well. However, this is more appropriate for our situation. Next, we went down to our properties here, and we enabled the use of port-based authentication on the switch, and we also set the authentication method to none, and this again was so that user credentials, because user credentials are not being used, we don't want to have that set to any of these, because if you do, using EAP-TLS, the connection is always going to fail, or the radius connection is always going to fail. So this has to be selected to none. And if you're using SNMP, you can enable your failure and success traps. Now for port authentication, is where we define the individual ports. And of course on Cisco switches you can define an interface range as well, where you want to define these 802.1x settings. We want to set our administrative port control to auto. This way 802.1x gets used. And then under host-based and session authentication, we want to set our multiple host as a good value to set. If you want to lock it down, you can of course use different values. That is everything that I wanted to cover. Thanks everyone for watching. Leave your comments below, and I love subscribers. If you have any ideas for another video, thanks again, RH. Please feel free to email me at info@osbornepro.com, and I'll be happy to try to oblige wherever I can. Thanks for watching.